We're going to be talking about data ingestion in Synapse in Fabric because now there are more ways to do things. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do this is frankly, I was trying to do something I couldn't figure it out, which is always the best way of creating a session. And there were, I was at a session that Powell did recently because naturally I can't get enough Fabric stuff because it's all new. And there were just a ton of questions about some of the stuff that I am going to cover. So I'm thinking that this will be information that many of you have not seen. So let's get started with all of the different ways that you, and granted, I only have 45 minutes. I know darn well that there are more than 3 ways that I could do this, but like I said, only 45 minutes, so I picked ones that would work. All right, so a little bit about me. My name is Ginger Grant. As you can tell from the accent, I am not in the UK, but in the US. Loved going over to the UK for SQL Bits earlier this year. I am a data platform MVP and wrote a book. And if you want to contact me, put up my contact information. I'm on Twitter way too much, so that's probably a good way of getting a hold of me at Desert Isle SQL. All right, so I said that I know that there's more than 3 ways. What 3 ways am I going to talk about today? Well, the first one I'm going to talk about are shortcuts. And shortcuts are a new Fabric-y thing. And then I'll put these out of order. And then I'm actually going to talk about Dataflow 2s. For those of you who've ever gotten stuck doing either Synapse Ingestion or ADF and thought, yuck, when you went to Dataflows, Dataflows 2s are a new and different thing. And I wanted to cover that so to support those of you who do Power BI as well. And if for those of you who don't and are doing ADF or Synapse Ingestion, how you can incorporate those into your environment. And lastly, Spark doesn't have a whole bunch of new stuff, but I am going to be talking about something that is new to me when looking at data ingestion and incorporating. It's not quite ChatGPT because it was actually came out in December of last year, but looking at snippets. So let's talk about all these different items today. So first up, we're going to talk about shortcuts which are available in Fabric. And this is a really good, so the goal with a lot of the stuff that I do with Synapse and with Fabric is to basically create a cloud-based data warehouse. And for my clients are all smaller. So the cool stuff that Indira talked about is generally overkill for the amount of data that they have because they have less than the terabyte that you would want to use for data ingestion. So looking at a data lakehouse, and then generally what my clients do is they use Power BI to visualize the data within it. But, you know, hey, with Synapse, you can always do a virtual database on top of your data lake. And they do that for people who need to do querying. But what's really cool about Fabric shortcuts is the way that you can use the one lake without having to move your data around, and frankly, just not having to move your data around, period. I know that when I first heard about one lake, I'm like, how's that going to work for GDPR? And once again, it's just basically a look of one, but not really one. And that's really what Fabrics does, because it's a lot like using a serverless database. It's virtual migration. So it just looks like it's in one place. It's not. So this is really cool because that means that you don't have to move things around that you already have. If you have to have things separate for various, you know, legal requirements in the country in which you operate, great, it's not going to interfere with that. You're just basically creating a shortcut. So to your users, the people actually using the data, they don't have to go all over the place to find it. And you don't need to move data around once it's in the cloud. And by cloud, we can even include stuff from AWS. And unfortunately, it doesn't work for Google Drive yet, but I will say that a majority of my clients who have clients in other clouds have data in AWS. So this does support that as well. And again, you're not moving it. So it's completely transparent to users. So I look at the Fabric shortcuts as being kind of like a data lake version of a kind of like a but I would not be surprised if there were not. All right. How's my audio now? Is that any better? I see that I lost it. Is my audio back now? Got it back. Yeah. I just realized my headset beeped at me, and I think that meant that it died, and I guess it did because you couldn't hear me anymore. All right. So glad that you can all hear me now. That is sort of the point. All right. Let's go back to looking at one cloud management. So basically, you can incorporate your data all in one place. So you don't have to physically move it. And this is kind of a good idea too, because I also like to move archive data to a slower, less optimal area, just because there's no reason to pay for that kind of storage when you don't need it. So this also supports that as well. So you cannot, for GDPR, hey, you can't store data from one country in one lake. Well, that's okay. You can store the data in ADLS Gen 2 in whatever country that you need to do it in. So if you are working on supporting GDPR, this is definitely something that you're going to want to take advantage of. One thing that to keep in mind, though, if you're using shortcuts, I know that a lot of people use private endpoints, and private endpoints are not presently supported with shortcuts. So keep that in mind. So you can create that shortcut in OneLake to virtually join data, but again, no private endpoints. So that is going to be an impediment to some people. So how do you implement a shortcut? What do you have to do? So you've got a couple of different paths. And if you ask me, I think this is backwards, but this is the nomenclature that works. The target path is the actual location where your data is stored. So if you have it in a data lake in Australia, that's your target path. Your shortcut path is where you want it to be. That's your OneDrive location. So if you do, of course, do something like move it on the back end. So if you move your target, yes, you broke the shortcut. So that's, always a consideration when you're virtualizing things. You can't move them around after you do that. So keep that in mind. So target is where it is. Shortcut path is where you are accessing it from. So your lake house is where this storage shortcut is going to be included. So it's just you can't do it in the data lake. It has to be within the lake house. So you have to create a lake house in Fabric to support this. So there's no support in subdirectories of tables, so you have to do it at least at the table level. And you put the shortcut in whenever you are looking for a file. And as you might guess, lake houses do require a premium SKU. I always like to mention a little bit about the licensing, because I know that you need to know if you can do this based on what you have in your work. So yes, this does require a premium SKU to work. But on the bright side, for those of you who haven't looked at the cost structure for Fabric yet, it's much different than Power BI, which is what a lot of people thought it was. It is something you can do it for less than $5,000 a month. So take a look at that in your environment. All right. So how shortcuts look in the database? Well, basically they look very similar. So it's just a different icon. So versus a table icon, you have a shortcut icon. And so it's obvious from looking at it, but it doesn't impede any of the work for it. So how do you make this happen? So first you open up the lakehouse, you right click on the lake view directory,
where you want to put it, and then you select new shortcut just on the list. It's pretty simple to do. And then you just select the source, and these are the sources available. I would be willing to bet that in the future that this list will be longer, but this is the current list. So your lists that you can select from are Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 and Amazon S3. So this is where you can select from. So if you've got anything in old school ADLS, sorry, it's not supported. So there's, of course, different things that you have to fill in depending on which one you pick. Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 is pretty simple, the URL, the connection name, and the authentication kind. So this is going to use centralized storage management. So for Amazon, of course, is a little bit more of information that you need to include. You need to include the URL, the connection name, the type of authentication, and then a username and password for your AWS storage. So it does use a single storage location for all connectivity. And this is not something that everybody needs to see after it's been connected. So you're going to want to make sure that you have it connected using an account that has relative permissions. Another thing that I wanted to make sure to bring up is that for Amazon, you have read-only access only. You can't do anything with your data by shortcut besides read it, which, go figure, is not particularly surprising. You have read-write access with Azure Data Lake Gen 2. So once you have filled out, hey, where is the location for this information? Then you just select where the shortcut is going to go, pick your different lake house that you might have in your list, and just say, here, this is where I want it. And the shortcut settings page is the same for both for AWS and for Azure Data Lake. You just give it a name and a target location and then the path and where the data is located. So that part is exactly the same. And then you will create a folder for the shortcut. So where the data can be accessed. Of course, if you're going to be using Lakehouse, you're probably going to have this in Parquet because that makes the most sense. And this is going to show you where that is. So you'll see it when you're setting it up. So notice here in my employees folder, I can then see my files that I have as part of my shortcut. And then it's just listed. So I have it listed in my files with that. Notice the icon is a little bit different, and I can call it whatever I wanted to. Now, how do you use shortcuts? Well, once you've got them created, it's actually pretty simple to incorporate them into your current environment. So let's say that you're doing Spark. So what you're going to be doing is then just basically loading it from tables, my shortcut. So you don't have to get into the path or anything. Oops, I'm going to go back here before I get off of this. So it's just pretty simple. So you're just using the virtual reference that you create. And if you're doing Spark SQL, then it's just selecting it from the lake house and then your shortcut name. So very easy to access it. So let's say that you're doing serverless. How would that work? If you're doing serverless, you're looking at doing it from my lake house and then the shortcut name. So, and you can do it if you want to in Workspace as well. All right, so let's move. So any questions about how you might incorporate shortcuts into your lakehouse? It's actually really cool because when I first saw this one lake thing, I'm like, yeah, that's never going to work. And now that I understand shortcuts, it's like, oh, yeah, that's fine. That'll work just no problem. Okay, so let's now move on to, that's not right, I'm doing Gen 2. So Dataflow Gen 2, it's funny because if you look at Dataflows, you're like, oh, look, there's a Dataflow in Azure Data Factory, which is, of course, included in Synapse Ingestion. And then you have Dataflows in Power BI, and they're not the same thing at all. Well, a Dataflow Gen 2 is taking the technology that is in Power BI. So this is a modification of a Power BI data flow, not a modification of an Azure Data Factory data flow. Question?
Victoria. Ja.
Thank you, whoever muted that person. All right. So with Dataflows Gen 2, this is basically expanding the what you have in Power BI and then allowing you to put that kind of code into your pipelines. So if you're like, I'm in pipelines, I don't get how to do pipelines in ADF. I do a lot with Power BI. Can I just use Power Query? The answer is now yes. So this uses M code, Power Query, just like Dataflows in Power BI. And the other thing too is if you've ever been creating a data flow and you start running it, you're like, oh crap, I forgot to save it. I hope I don't get kicked off. What I really like about it is that you can save without waiting to finish. So if it blows up, you could still save your work and you're like, no, I want to get back from right here. So I really like that aspect. And you can cut and paste code from Power Query. So if you've got a data flow and you're like, yeah, that already exists in your Power BI service, you can bring it over. And you can also choose to export queries from data flows as well. So how do Dataflow Gen 2s work? So they do have limits, of course you got to start somewhere and they're starting a little bit small. So the destinations are kind of small. So your destinations for Dataflow Gen 2, Fabric Lakehouse, surprise, surprise, Azure Data Explorer, Synapse Analytics, and Azure SQL DB. So there's no other place that you can include as a destination. These are the only, so if you wanted to move it straight to ADLS Gen 2, you can't. It's not supported. So keep that in mind when you're deciding to incorporate a Dataflow Gen 2 into your pipeline. So how can you incorporate the code that you already have? So let's, you basically are just selecting your existing data flow that you have in the Power BI service. And then, of course, I'm assuming that you've converted your Power BI service to the new Fabric that won't work any other way. So then when you do that, when you open up your data flow, you'll see this little icon which says, and it's on the Home tab, Export Template. And they call it a template because I guess they figure that all the code that you write is template worthy. Man, I wish all my code was template worthy, but we'll just go with that. And so when you select your data flow, you go to home, that icon is there on the right hand side, and it saves the data flow as a download as a PQT file. So it automatically downloads it for you. So you're going to get it on your machine. That's how that's going to work. So you have a PQT file that is going to be exported. And then you can import that P2 file into ADF. So the import is the same as you might do for Power BI. So you've got those different ones that you're able to do like that. So really kind of a cool way of doing that. So then you just select Dataflow Gen 2 and then you import it. And you can bring them in, import the same as you would in Power BI. So you can export from ADF using Gen 2s into Power BI should you wish to go that route, if you can do that. So you can go back and forth with your two different versions there. All right, the last thing I wanted to talk about was Spark pipelines, because I use a lot of Spark for doing a lot of data ingestion, using data engineering. And basically, I'm going to be using Azure Synapse for this, because for the code that I'm talking about, it is available as part of Azure Synapse. And what I wanted to mention, if you haven't seen this first, or if you've been writing a lot of your code in ADF and you were thinking, well, I don't know Python, I don't know, this is all hard, I'm just going to keep on using what I've been using, I really encourage you to start looking more into Python. And while we don't have Copilot yet for all of our code, we do have snippets, which is the next best thing. So these code snippets are basically taking common tasks that you might be using right now in Spark, or you want to know that you want to do them in Spark, and basically give you the framework that you need to create them. So to do that, I'll show you how to do that. So basically, code snippets, I would describe it as IntelliSense on steroids, because it is more like IntelliSense than I would say it is like Copilot. And you access it by just using snippet in your notebook. And then you can use the code because it's giving you that framework. You would need to fill it in with things that make sense to you, and you can go ahead and do that. So let's take a look at how you can create snippets from within in your code within Synapse. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Synapse here. And I've just gone ahead and created a new notebook. And this isn't anything particularly special. I have selected that I wanted my kiddie pool to run. So got my pool selected here. It's a brand new notebook. So I'm going to start creating some snippets within this notebook that I might want to use for my code. So probably the first thing I'm going to do, of course, select a code component, and then I'm just going to type snippets. And I didn't even get very far. And this shows you how the different things that I could probably do with it. So what I might do with this is I might say, well, shoot, what kind of things might I want to do here? And you'll notice like, wow, there's a lot of stuff. So let's say that I want to read data from my data lake. It gives me a framework of what I need to do, tells me everything I need to write it, and just basically put in my file path name here. So I can easily use this outline to create code that I can just go and run it here. And then I've got I've got JSON file if I want it, and I've got Parquet if I want it too. So, the parts I don't need, I never read JSON, is just delete it and then keep on going. So there's a number of things that you can do in here. I really like some of the elements when it comes to looking at some of the, whoops, that was faster. When it comes to the plotting, because some of this is kind of difficult, and I generally have to look this up because I don't do it that often. So it gives you some of the idea of the different code elements that you can choose to create with as well, that you might not know how to do, like looking at your different heat maps. And I have Python selected so that it is going to give me, again, contextual based on what I've got selected. But if I want to, write data to data lake, basically telling me what I need to do this. So if you don't know how to write Python and you're looking at some of the common tasks that you might be using within Synapse, your snippets will get you everywhere you need to go with that. So it's really a great place for people who aren't that familiar with Python yet and want to get started. And this is good code. I mean, I know that, people are always looking for, well, yeah, I can write it, but what's considered a good format? And this is going to create code in a format that is well formatted code. So if you're wondering what that looks like, this is a pretty good example of the kinds of things that you can do with that. So any questions about how you might use this to write code? So yeah, if you're kind of wondering about this, just go ahead and just type snippets in a notebook and see what you are able to take a look at within your code. Okay. All right, so that's Spark code snippets. So in this session, we took a look at doing data shortcuts and looking at how you can use shortcuts with Fabric that are going to help you incorporate a bunch of different elements into your data lake. so that you don't have to move data around if you have them already in Azure or even if you have them in AWS. By the way, one of the things that I didn't mention is that for ADLS Gen 2, your security model is inherited. So whatever security is currently set up with Azure Data Lake Gen 2 will be what is incorporated in this environment. So you'll have all of the same security. You don't have to set up anything different. What you have will apply. And that is going to be the same. For Dataflow Gen 2, talked about how you can copy them back and forth. So if you, for how to do that, there's content for that you might want to do that will help you with that. And lastly, I talked about a ways of getting Spark running within your environment by using snippets to write all of your code for you. So with that, I was just wondering if anybody has any questions.